Lecture 14, Ugolino, Dante's Last Sympathetic Sinner.
It seems ungrateful to do so, because the Romantics, in fact, rediscovered Dante. But the burden of the remarks that are going to follow is that the Romantics were very bad readers of Dante's text, at least if we're interested in the moral basis of that text. It's also difficult for us near the end of the 20th century, who've grown up even in America, a long way across the sea from Italy, hearing the name Dante. There are many athletes whose first name is Dante. He's grown up in our culture in a way that he would have been very surprised, I think, to find. Everyone knows there's a place called Dante's Inferno. It's very often a bar when it gets translated into an actual place in our civilization. Everyone's heard of Dante. It's really quite amazing. Not all that many people have read him. But we would, I think, if we polled, let's say, Americans in 1996, we would find an astoundingly high name recognition for Dante. If we had polled the world in, say, 1750, we would have gotten outside of Italy, and even in Italy we would not have found that much compared to today, for instance. We would have found that basically no one either had heard of Dante, or if they'd heard of him, wanted to talk about him very much. Those people who spend time arguing about the canon of great works should take into account the fact that whether you like canons or dislike them, that the thing we can say most true about them is that they're shifting. And if your time frame is long enough, you will find that they change even quite radically from moment to moment in human history. I say this because I think it's important to realize that without the Romantic rediscovery of Dante, starting in the end of the 18th century and having its full fruit in the early 19th century, Dante would not have been in great books courses. This writer whom I think I would with great certainty be able to say he is at least one of the 5 greatest writers who's ever lived, and find hardly anyone who would want to debate that point. It's quite remarkable, I believe, that I am able to make such gestures precisely because the Romantics rediscovered Dante. And they did so by reading him in a way I, the ingrate, I'm employed by their rediscovery of Dante, would like to suggest the way in which they read him is not a good way of reading Dante, at least if we care about the poem that Dante left us rather than the way in which we want to take it and make it do what we would like it to. As one might imagine, the Romantic reading of Dante centers on the great figures in Inferno. In fact, most Romantic prose about this text is centered in the Inferno. The Romantics find that Dante is magnificent in expressing great feeling, and you may have heard that I, in my own mind, was capitalizing that G and that F. That is what Dante is the marvelous poet of. He knows how to explore the depth of human emotion. I'm not going to tell you I think that's untrue. I think it's very true. It's one of the reasons that everyone who has liked Dante has liked him over the years, indeed over the centuries. But what they do, the Romantics in their reading of him, is locate those particularly terrifying or beautiful moments in the Inferno of particularly affecting characters. And one might guess what that list would include. Certainly Francesca, who gets written about them a great deal, by them a great deal. Farinata in the 10th canto. Pierre de la Vigne in the 13th. Ulysses, notably, in Canto 26. And the subject of today's talk, Ugolino, in the 33rd canto of the Inferno. And probably the first and last of that list the most, Francesca and Ugolino. Let me try to look at the problem we're going to approach now from what I conceive to be, it's hubris to say from Dante's point of view, from what I conceive to be Dante's point of view. What was the challenge? Challenge was how to present sinful characters in such a way that when they seem most positively affecting to us, that we're nonetheless able to read through and behind their very rhetoric to see what's wrong with it, to understand, in other words, that they convict themselves out of their own mouths. Now, this is a chancy business. It's a strategy that relies on a particular kind of readerly intelligence and readerly involvement in the text of the poem. That means we have to be reading very closely and paying very close attention to Dante, to feel his moves, as it were. So it's a high-risk strategy on the part of an author, and it's one that doesn't always pay off. I would argue that essentially Dante was wrong in hoping that we would be able to track this strategy, and at least in the modern reading of the Commedia, we get very confused and tend to accept the self-evaluations of various of the sinners in the Inferno as being the way that we ought to read them, the way that we should respond to them. That's what they'd like, and it is not, I would argue, what the author of the poem would like. Further, the situation is complicated because the author of the poem is also a character in the poem. He is interacting with them, and when we first begin watching him interact, we realize that he's got some major problems of his own. That is, he is markedly prone to sinfulness. We see in the Francesca canto, the fifth canto of the Inferno, at the end of that interview, Dante faints with some sense of identity with Paolo and with Francesca. And we understand that that's probably not what he ought to be doing, that he should be resisting the temptation that she represents to him. That's just one example of the kind of problem that we have. Whom do we identify with? Do we identify with the sinner? Do we identify with the poet himself, apparently identifying with the sinner? Or do we claim to hear the sterner voice of the poet who is criticizing, at least implicitly, that younger self who fainted out of affection and identity with Francesca? Let me give you what I take to be a classically lovely instance of how Dante makes it possible for you to read away from identifying with the sinner. Now, I'm not sure this is true. I think it's very pretty. I'd like to believe it is true, but I will try it for you. At the very end of Francesca's very famous speech, perhaps the best-known 18 lines of literature in the West, is known by heart by millions of Italian school children who grow up into full-fledged Italian men and women who can at any moment recite these 18 lines. All you have to do is mention the first one and off they go. I've had that happen. The very last line of her speech, the 138th verse of the fifth canto, is just quel giorno non vi leggemo avante, and that day we read in it no further. She's referring to the Lancelot romance, which she and Paolo read and which gets them to fall in love and causing eventually, since Paolo is, as some of you know, not her husband, but her brother-in-law, with whom she's having an adulterous relationship, and that kissing over the book ends up in a murder on the part of her husband, who dispatches the two of them. Now, Dante does put Francesca in hell and not in purgatory on the way to heaven, so we have to assume that he agreed with God's judgment, as it were, that she was indeed a sinner and that she's being punished for the sin of lust. That being true, can we see something behind her last line? And that day we read in it no further. Well, a Korean Dante scholar, Thomas Seung, many years ago in a book that he wrote called The Fragile Leaves of the Sibyl, pointed to a resonance in that line, which I think is right. And I've written on this as well. I'm seconding his original perception. And yet I think it's one that makes so much sense that I'm surprised that it waited so long to be discovered, if it is an accurate discovery. It's always chancy in this business, too. It's a very important line. It is perhaps the culminating moment of a work that we know Dante knew and loved and dealt with, the Confessions of St. Augustine. In the culminating moment of the Confessions, in Book 8, Chapter 12, Augustine reading St. Paul, Romans 13:14, when he is converted forever from lust and to charity, When he reads that crucial passage in Paul's text, he says, "And I did not wish to read any further." In other words, I'm claiming, after T.K. that when Francesca says, and that day we read no further in it, in that book, it's a parody of the moment of Augustinian conversion, that where Augustine says, I did not wish to read any further because I'd read enough and was converted finally. Here Francesca is saying, and that day we did not read any further in the book because we made love, and even implying that on later days they read the book and made more love until they were dispatched. If that's true, if Dante meant us to see the citation of this crucial passage in St. Augustine at the end of Francesca's speech, then our way of responding to her, seems to me, is radically altered. At least it's altered if we're trying to read her romantically. We suddenly see a grid on which to place her. Here she is talking about love, talking about reading a romance, talking about not being guilty but being compelled by the force of love that called upon her to do things that now have resulted in her damnation. Yet we're reminded that there was free choice all the while. We're reminded that she did have options. We're reminded that she had her will, exactly what Augustine exercised finally, successfully in the 8th book of the Confessions, what he had been unable to exercise despite the excellence of his intellect. He finally gathers his will in that 8th book. She gathers her will in exactly the wrong direction. Now, as I say, if that is true, if we are meant to justify Francesca's behavior, we're not going to be able to do so if we can see that it's being parodied by the model that it doesn't follow. Here she is, what's she doing? Reading a book. That's what Augustine did. Augustine's reading a book by a man named Paul. She's kissing a man named Paul. The parallels, though they are historical, are nonetheless so great as to make coincidence seem to me at least a little bit unlikely. Thus, that sort of strategy, if it's what Dante employed, we have to say one thing about it. It was not very successful. It took a Korean graduate student who came out of the war between the two Koreas to Yale, studying for a doctoral degree in philosophy, and he was the first person who noticed this. Now, you know, if that was a strategy, it's not a very good strategy, or we're not very good readers, or both. And I think I would submit that the latter is probably the best construction to understand the situation. Dante's too good for us, but maybe a little bit too good for himself. The pattern of liking the Inferno and liking the great sinners of Inferno that we find in romantic readings of the poem make us realize that it's exactly the moments in the Inferno where Dante is testing himself the most by feeling identity for various sinners, and the list that I read a little while ago is perhaps worth repeating: Francesca, Farinata, Pier Lavinia, Ulysses, Ugolino, to name the 5 most prominent of them perhaps, that when you look carefully at what's happening in the poem, you realize that there are cycles of the purgation of pity and fear moving through the Inferno. That it is what we call many 19th century novels. It is a kind of Bildungsroman, a novel about the education of its young hero. Dante's 35 years old as hero of the Commedia. That's not that young, but young enough perhaps. And he's certainly learning. He's developing in the course of his 7 days in the afterworld. That as we see him move through the Inferno, we realize that Dante had another problem. How do you motivate your character? How do you motivate your work? Well, learning is a good way to motivate a work. Otherwise, the Commedia would have seemed terribly static. But it's not. It's a wonderfully moving poem, moving in every sense of the word, moves us, but also moves forward. It develops. Things change in it. And in the course of a week, Dante, the main character, is a much different character from the one who started out. As he moves through the Inferno at crucial moments, usually one in each of the 5 great areas of the Inferno, we'll see him moving from pity and through fear to firmness until he's proof against the sins of that particular part of the poem. I can demonstrate that, but it takes a little bit of time. I'm going to ask you to trust me. That there really is a very carefully aligned system of development moving through the poem. To a certain degree, these sympathetic figures occur where Dante is being tested by pity in each of the 5 great areas of the poem. So there's a technical reason for him as character within the poem to express his admiration or deep interest or identity with or sympathy for particular sinners. But he's not supposed to be doing that. He's supposed to be firming himself against such people. Now, I very briefly would like to suggest ways in which we can see that this is how we should feel, rather than following the gestures of the poet protagonist, that is Dante as character within the poem, who is going to lead us to feeling that it's all right to sympathize with the sinners. Francesca, as I mentioned, who for the Romantics is a much more successful creation than Beatrice, who is the heroine of the poem, the center of its moral and theological values for Dante. She, as some people suggest, seems more like a version of St. Thomas in drag than a living, breathing woman. Well, that's a very 20th century way of thinking about what's wrong with Beatrice. But for Dante, it's exactly what's right about Beatrice, that she is someone who is capable of understanding what charity is, what true love is, and of leading her lover, Dante, who is not her lover in any carnal sense of the word, toward understanding. Nothing greater can be done. And I think Dante understood fully well what chances he was taking with so unromantic a heroine, and expected us to understand how we had to deal with that. Romantic readers go wild. They come to Francesca and say, a flesh and blood woman, a real human being, so much superior to that schoolmarm Beatrice who is so boring. Well, that's fine. And in a romantic reading, if that's what turns you on, go ahead and do it. But Dante, Dante would be looking at you with a mixture of disdain and simply not caring at all. You weren't the reader he meant to reach. And if writing great poems entitles you to anything, is to hope that you have at least some readers who began to understand what it is that you were trying to accomplish in your work. I think Dante would have been maybe slightly amused at some of the excesses of romantic readings, but essentially quite annoyed by them. He would have agreed with one of his better commentators, Francesco da Buti, who in the late 14th century said, "On earth there is time for compassion, in hell only for justice." I think that's a good reading of Dante's view of his own sinners. That, in other words, at any time if we are feeling compassion for the sinners that we see in the Inferno, we're being bad readers. That's not a Christian way of reading the poem, and a merely aesthetic way of reading the poem is beyond the poem's possibility. It's ruled out by the poem itself. Now, that doesn't stop us from misbehaving, and misbehave we do. We are human, and we like to read things the way we like to read them. We find people like me who keep trying to argue for a more strictly moralizing reading of the poem boring, and I can understand. I really can understand that. I'm going to continue to disagree with you, but I do understand how you feel, and I understand the delight of the carnal, romantic reading of Dante. And as I've already suggested, that romantic reading is a wonderful and even liberating reading, as wrong as it is. It is often beautifully written. Its greatest exponent is perhaps Francesco de Sanctis, and his pages are, to this day, crisp, wondrously clear, and terribly moving. I think they are almost always absolutely wrong, but absolutely wrong. You can learn a lot from reading de Sanctis. I don't think that the greatness of the misconception takes away from its misconceivedness, but it does have its greatness and its power. It's a very convincing version of the poem that doesn't fit Dante. If you were going to write Dante in the 19th century, it would have come out the way de Sanctis reads it. Now, the soft readings of Dante, if you want to call a romantic reading a soft reading, is, I think, in real difficulty every time you look closely. If you look at Francesca, what do you see? A constant in her speech is that she's always blaming somebody else. If you look at Farinata, who is there punished in heresy, in what way is what Farinata doing heretical? Well, I think we can put it together from the text of the poem. Francesca is talking about politics in church, to put it very broadly. And he talks about the prayers that are made in our temple when the discussion is, shall we destroy Florence or not? Suddenly we get some idea of the way in which heresy and politics cross and become one, where you confuse this world for the other, when you confuse the realm of the sacral and the political, when in church you plan the destruction of your native city. That is a kind of heresy, the Ghibelline heresy, that imperial politics that Dante knew only too well, an imperial politics that was based not on God, as was Dante's imperial politics, but on politics alone, politics for its own sake. In some profoundly true way for Dante, politics, pure politics, was itself a dreadful form of heresy. So we can look at Farinata, who is magnanimous, is the word Dante uses for him, is great-souled, is impressive, is imposing, and is powerful. But he also is a heretic, and we can see the mark of his heresy upon him, though no technical terms for heresy are ever used of him. We have to make the transposition. For Pierre de Lavigne, one detail. Pierre, who was the second in command to the most glorious potentate in 13th century Europe, Frederick II, a truly extraordinary figure. His chancellor, Frederick, who had enormous power because he had the keys, as he says, to the emperor's heart, reminding us of St. Peter's 2 keys to the kingdom. And he, too, can deny access, he can lock or he can open, and he knows he has this remarkable power. He was imprisoned by his emperor and killed himself in prison, most horribly. And in so doing, in committing suicide, he makes his way into Dante's universe and is represented in the 13th canto as a suicide. What do we know about him? He presents a totally self-absolving portrait of himself. He says, it's envy that got me in trouble. People were talking me up behind my back, and that's what got the boss upset, and he put me in prison. And then I committed suicide because they made me do it. Once again, it's someone who is expressing his absence of guilt to us. But do we accept that? God doesn't play dice with the universe. No, and in Dante's universe, God does not make mistakes about who's in hell. Pierre de Lavigne has not been falsely sentenced by God. He's there for exactly the right reason, and because he is guilty of his sin. When he concludes his self-exculpating remarks, which Dante is allowed to hear, what he says is that I did not break faith with my Lord. And that's his culminating self-defense. We just need to let that phrase echo a little bit, and we begin to see what's at stake. I did not break faith with my Lord. I did not sell Frederick's goods. I did not commit barratry, the very sin that Dante was accused of, by the way. I didn't do that, he says. I did not break faith with my Lord. And then we realize we can hear that and hear it in a different way with a different focus. You have another faith which is directed to quite different Lord. And that is exactly what he did. He broke faith with his Lord when he committed suicide. Suicide for Christians, and that's another and very long topic, suicide for Christians is precisely the act of despair in which you break faith, you cut off your contact through the Holy Spirit to God, and you despair of being loved by God. You're specifically in Matthew and in other places in the Christian tradition enjoined against doing that. So his very locution in which he says, I didn't cheat on the boss, reminds you of the larger issue that he has failed to involve himself correctly in. He broke faith with his Lord. Or Ulysses, perhaps the most written about character in all of Dante. Ulysses is a remarkable picture of an enormously gifted con man. Ulysses is able to get people that he needs to be his oars because he wants to take a trip to the South Pole. And he gives this little oration, which he himself calls it, I gave this little speech, and after I gave it, I could hardly have held them back, he says. I'm such a good little orator. that I inflamed these men to row me outside the gates of Hercules. And I would argue that the more closely you look at the Ulysses scene, the more you realize that you are hearing the voice of the con man. That Ulysses, whom we have heroized enormously in our reception of the comedy, is in fact exactly where he belongs, in hell, as a fraudulent counselor. He's given bad advice, not an inefficacious advice so much as advice which is going to cause you difficulty. Now, with that as introduction, let's turn to what is, I think, indisputably the most moving scene in the comedy, certainly in the Inferno, the scene involving Ugolino, Count Ugolino. The story is a Pisan story. If you go to Pisa today, you will see a little plaque on the tower, which is no longer a tower because all the towers have been torn down in Italy in the Middle Ages, because if you had a tower, you could defend yourself and take power. And so we had a leveling, literally, in Italian civic life, and towers were simply torn down because they were dangerous places. Powerful people got hold of them. So that the tower is not a tower anymore, but you can see where this event occurred. Ugolino, and I won't go into the Pisan politics of the 1280s, which are enormously complicated. Just say about them that everybody's on the wrong side. People who should be Ghibellines, that is part of the party of the emperor, are Guelphs, and Guelphs who ought to be, people who ought to be Guelphs have turned into Ghibellines. Everybody is playing games. There's a three-cornered political dispute, and in it we have the archbishop, who is associated with the church, and that should be a Guelph, who is a Ghibelline, and you have Ugolino, who is from a Ghibelline party, who has turned Guelph in this political intrigue. It's an enormous intrigue. There's a lot to be said against everybody, and Ugolino was the one who got caught. And was accused of betraying castles to the Florentines. It was part of a political deal rather than an act of betrayal. At least he thinks that, and that may be correct. But Ruggieri, his opponent, the archbishop, had something on him, and so was able to get him imprisoned. And with him, in fact, his sons, 2 sons, and 2 grandchildren. Dante turns them all into 4 very young children. And we are given in verses 3 to 74 of the 33rd canto of the Inferno, this enormously moving account of Ugolino's last week. It takes 7 days for him to starve to death in the tower, and we're given that narrative. It's impossible not to feel empathy for Ugolino as he describes these events, and I confess that as I read the scene year after year, I didn't understand it. But I was always moved by it. It's impossible not to be moved by it. It's an enormously powerful scene. No matter what you do to it, no matter how you read it, the description of this diminution into death and the impossibility of doing anything while it's happening to you, especially if you are a father, and especially if you have 4 young children that you are morally in charge of and whom you're able to do nothing for. All of that is readily understood. Perhaps the greatest piece ever written on this was written by Francesco de Sanctis in 1869. It's one of his greatest pieces on Dante, which is saying something because all of his things on Dante are worth having. And his piece has a subtitle, and it is The Drama of Ugolino, the Drama of Paternity. And that has been, in many respects, the governing text for our appreciation of the work. And I would like to suggest that the title is just The Drama of Paternity. It is the drama of paternity, but it's the drama of a failed father, a father who makes the wrong choices, who does the wrong things. And I would like to argue that, once again, it is biblical text which gives us a way of looking more clearly at what's at stake in the decisions that that Ugolino makes or doesn't make. And I can demonstrate this first by looking at some little details in what I would call Ugolino's displacement of significance. I mean, he gets the significance, but he gets something out of place in it. His first words, people have talked about this a good deal. You want me to renew the hopeless grief, he begins. Words that pick up Aeneas when he's talking to Dido in the second book of Virgil's Aeneid. And this is a commonplace in the Dante commentaries and has been for centuries now. Aeneas says to Dido, "You command me, O queen, to renew the unspeakable grief." Two of the words are the same in Italian and Latin, renew and grief. And there could be really no doubt but that Dante is reminding us of that sad moment in the Aeneid when Aeneas is asked by Dido to tell the story of the fall of Troy. And you get the plangent atmosphere that Virgil evokes as well as any poet ever has. So that's the scene in the background. What's striking here is not that surprising that Dante should advert to it. What's surprising is that he's already done so. That is, the opening lines of Francesca's speech echo, as has been noticed for a long time in the commentary tradition, similarly echo the same speech in the Aeneid. And it had bothered me for years that Dante should repeat a citation in that way. And I always wondered, or half wondered, I wasn't smart enough to see that there was something going on here, that I was being asked to think. That if Dante is repeating himself at the beginning of this speech and is mirroring another fairly parallel occasion, that is a sympathetic sinner who is asking for our fondness. Here's another one asking Dante to weep for him and feel sorry for him. And both start off by citing that speech when Aeneas responds to Dido's inquiry to tell about the fall of Troy. And suddenly it dawned on me, what I'm supposed to say is exactly that. I've heard that one before. Now, that, if I say it that way, I'm getting the idea. Oh, when Francesca did that, it got to Dante, he fainted, and it got to me. I think she's great. I don't like Beatrice very much. If Dante knew there'd be 19th century readers. And now I should be proof against it. Look out. When they start quoting that Dido Aeneas business at the beginning of book 2, look out. They are trying to win you over. They're trying to gain your adherence to a fallen side or something like that. We've heard the song before. Now, Ugolino has a purpose when he sets out to tell his narrative to Dante. He wants to set Dante and us straight about Ruggiere's cruelty to him at verses 19 to 21 of the canto. His attempt to win Dante's pity is not successful, and it's very important where Francesca was successful. We have to note that Ugolino is not. He fails to win Dante over. Dante resists him. And the episode leaves us with Dante condemning the Pisans for putting the children to such torture. That's exactly the word he uses. Verse 87, I think. Yes, it is verse 87. There's nothing about the father. You know, oh, Pisa, he says. And he's really terrible. The Florentines are always hard on Pisa, but the Pisans are pretty hard on the Florentines, too. And you know, what he's saying, oh, Pisans, you know, how could you put those children to such torture? Which says, you kill the old man, but nothing is said about Ugolino. How could you do that to that father would be what the Sanctus reading would make you say. How could you make a father suffer that? That's not what Dante says. And in verse 42 of the scene, when Ugolino says to him, it's a fantastic moment, Ugolino says to him, if you don't weep at this, he's halfway through the narrative, at what do you ever weep? We learn something terribly important. Ugolino expects Dante to cry. This canto has more words for weeping in it than any other except the 30th canto of the Purgatory, which is supposed to be happy, but that's another lecture. Is loaded with words for weeping and tears. And what do you ever weep at, Dante? Well, what we know is he's not weeping now. That's the only thing we can say is if this were Canto 5, he'd probably be weeping, but he's gotten better. He's learned to resist the ministrations of sinners. And the evidence from the text itself makes us see that Dante this time has not given over and joined up with Ugolino. What's interesting is see the character who allows you to sympathize with Francesca in Canto 5 has now gotten stronger, but a romantic reader is still over there and wants to read the character sympathetic, even though the author, as character in the poem, is no longer doing so. I find that very interesting. He is deflected, and when we first see him, and this is a detail that has gotten passed over, when we first see him, he's chewing on the nape of the neck of Ruggieri, and this scene is borrowed actually from Statius, a supposedly minor, but in his day major poet. who followed Virgil. And from his epic, there's a scene in which a dying, fallen battler asks for the body of the one who killed him and starts chewing on the nape of his head. And we get that cannibalistic opening scene. When Ugolino opens his mouth and lifts it from the gory head of his neighbor, he calls him his neighbor, a good Christian word. We're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. Well, that's how he loves his neighbor. And when he lifts his mouth from the neighbor to talk to Dante, he does so for one reason. Because Dante said, if you tell me why this guy deserves this of you, I'll tell the world. And that's what gets him to speak. Because Dante will give him vengeance. But we also remember the scripture. The scripture says, vengeance is mine, I shall repay, saith the Lord. But Ugolino wants vengeance through the agency of Dante. My argument is he doesn't get it. Now, he is based, as far as I can see, and this is something that I did discover some years ago, if it's right. His scene is based on St. Luke, on precisely St. Luke 11, in a network of images that I find absolutely convincing. That he should have had the Bible in mind is no surprise. Dante is the most biblical of poets. That we haven't seen this, it seems to me, is somewhat more surprising. And I think the reason we haven't seen it is because we have bought into the romantic reading of the text. Now, we're a single canto from the pit of hell. There are only 34 cantos in hell, and we're at 33. In 34, we find Satan, the archetypal rebellious son. And Satan, like Ugolino, is chewing on people. He's chewing on Judas's head and Brutus and Cassius's feet. Now, in the canto before him, we have Ugolino, who is chewing on Ruggeri's head. So you have the archetypal rebellious son, countered by, in my view, the archetypal failed father, Ugolino. Ugolino, who should have done better as a father than he did. Let me read you the parable of the importunate friend. That's what it's called. It's only in Luke so named. And it's Luke 11:5 through 13. And he said unto them, which of you shall have a friend, and shall go into him at midnight, and say unto him, friend, lend me 3 loaves. For a friend of mine in his journey is come to me, and I have nothing to set before him. And he from within shall answer and say, trouble me not. The door is now shut, and my children are with me in bed. I cannot rise and give thee. And if the other shall persevere in his knocking, I say unto you, though he will not rise and give him because he is his friend, yet because of his importunity he will rise and give him as many as he needs. And I say unto you, ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened. If a son shall ask bread of any of you that is a father, will he give him a stone? Or if he ask a fish, will he for a fish give him a serpent? Or if he shall ask an egg, will he offer him a scorpion? If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts unto your children, how much more shall your heavenly Father give the Holy Spirit to them that ask him? Now, there's so many details in that parable that ring true or echo. The knocking, which here we have parodied in the locking up of the gate, the nailing shut of the gate of the tower. The knocking that Ugolino doesn't commit. Ugolino is put in the role of the baker who doesn't want to give bread. He refuses bread to his children. Now, the bread that he refuses to his children is another kind of bread than bread. That is, it's the spiritual sustenance that he, as a father, had to have known about. When I was teaching this many years ago, the scene, it suddenly dawned on me that I'd never asked, and in fact the commentaries haven't asked the right question. The right question is, if you were in prison with your children, and you're a Catholic, and it's the 13th century, what would you do in this situation? And I know, and we all know perfectly well what we do. We would say, first of all, I'm sorry, this isn't your fault. you aren't involved. It's terrible that they're doing it to you. Exactly what Dante later says, how terrible it was that the Pisans locked up and murdered the children. You first apologize to the children because your political life got them here. And then you'll say, well, in a week we'll all be dead, and maybe you will be in heaven. Let us pray. And I don't have to know a lot about Christianity or Catholicism to know what we need to do. If I don't know many prayers, there's the Lord's Prayer. Now, it's curious that in Luke, I beg your pardon, in Luke's Gospel, the speech to which I advert, the teaching of the Lord's Prayer, occurs in the 11th book of Luke's Gospel. That's the first half of 11, is the teaching of the apostles. And that being true, the two things kind of focus, don't they? They come together. Ugolino says himself that he's a stone-hearted man. Si dentro impetrai. So did I turn to stone within, at verse 49. The problem for Ugolino is that he's got a Stoic model where a Christian one is appropriate. What do you do when everything goes wrong? You don't cry out. But this is the very man who charges Dante for not weeping. Strange behavior, isn't it? He won't cry out for his children until after they die. He doesn't want to see them have them see him as being weak. That would be a terrible thing. But it would have been better to have been able to weep for and with his children than to withhold affection and withhold what is the only possibility for their eternal lives in joy. But for all we never find out where they are in the afterworld. Dante leaves that as an enigma for us. It would have been a nice touch if in Paradiso 32 we'd seen Ugolino's children. But we don't get that kind of showbiz mentality making this poem. We're spared such things. We're rather left with the enigma. What happens to the children? And what kind of father was he to let their situation pass in an entirely natural way? That is, they die one by one, crying, and he does not cry out to them until he gropes over their bodies. He blind with hunger, and they on the way to their deaths. It's an extraordinary scene, and it's one that has a kicker, and I'm going to spend 2 minutes on that kicker because it's one that almost everyone today talks about. I think it's a mistake to give it as much attention as it gets. Most writing about the 33rd canto of the Inferno center on the 75th verse of that canto, which is, then more than grief had fasting power. That's a very bad literal translation. Then more than grief, fasting had power. Now, some people interpret that, though it's largely currently an American phenomenon, as meaning that Ugolino ate the children. And there's been a debate about this that's going on in the commentaries, but it's a sporadic debate because very few commentators have actually thought that this was a possibility. And I would just suggest that, in my own view, is that it's not even raised as a possibility by the text. It's raised as a possibility by commentators. We do that, you know. We do create problems. We not only don't solve problems that need a solution, but we create problems that aren't problems. I'm afraid that's our business, and I'm afraid we're very good at it. But the passage in itself, it seems to me, doesn't really leave that much ambiguity. Had Dante wanted us to think of Ugolino as eating his children, he would have said, then hunger had more power than grief, or something of that. So he says, then fasting had more power than grief. And fasting means when you don't eat. Further, Dante knows from Macrobius that you can live a week without food. Had Ugolino ingested the children, he wouldn't have died in a week. You know, physics and things like that, biology matter. Further, we have no testimony from the time because the corpses were taken out of the tower and brought down and displayed. And had there been leg muscles missing and teeth marks, you know, it would have made all the periodicals. There were the equivalent of periodicals in the 13th century. We would have heard about it, and the commentary tradition is silent on the issue. This, I think, is a fairly sure bet that he didn't eat the children. That is a footnote, and I will now conclude as follows. Ugolino's 7 days in the unmaking parallel God's 7 days of creation. Like the importuned and eventual provider in Christ's parable, he lies behind a locked door with his children. Unlike him, he will not be moved by entreaty. His posthumous importuning of Dante did not move our poet, at least not on his behalf. As so has often been the case with regard to other great figures of the Inferno, it has been all too successful with the poet's enthusiastic admirers. Luke's words, it's my contention, may help to restore the moral and aesthetic ground upon which Ugolino's drama is played out.